How's it going, guys? Topic for today's video. This is something that I briefly touched upon in a video that I just did recently where I was talking about should you build your own tiny house, or should you have someone assist you, or should you just have a company build your tiny house on wheels for you. Now, I briefly just kind of talked about this right at the start, and I think one of the most important questions that you need to ask yourself is a tiny house on wheels, is that going to be the right living modality for me? Because over the last couple of years, the tiny house movement has just garnered so much attention. And I was first introduced to the tiny house movement after watching the documentary Tiny. And I saw this guy basically build a tiny house from the ground up pretty well on his own with the assistance of some friends and some family. And at that point, I was so set. I'm like, I really want to build a tiny house. It just made sense for me at that time in my life because I didn't want to get into a huge mortgage, and I also wanted to be able to move the home wherever I wanted to because I wasn't exactly sure where I wanted to live. And at that point I was still living in Canada. So a couple of the main draws that attracted me to the tiny house movement was that it's a home that was inexpensive, you could move it, and it's also something that you could build yourself. And I just thought that that was like the perfect trifecta. And so that's why I was really like, I really want to do this. One of the things that I've noticed with the tiny house movement is that a lot of people get really excited. They're like, I really want a tiny house. They either build it themselves or they have one built for them. And they either eventually just sell it or they just outgrow the house. Because living in 200 square feet, like our tiny house, like the footprint's 200 square feet, the total living space would be about 260, 270 if you include the lofts. If we had somebody else in our family, if we had like a little baby, like that would make living in this tiny home very, very difficult. Even two people just living in a tiny home can be quite difficult because there have been stories of people, couples who have moved into a tiny home together and they ended up breaking up because there's just such a small amount of space, and it can just be, it could be certainly straining on a relationship. So if you're really interested in living in a tiny house or having one built for you, then the first question that you really want to ask yourself is, where am I gonna put it? Because that question can really determine the type of modality of housing that is really gonna work for you. Because there's different modalities of how you can live within the world. You can live in a tiny house on wheels, you can live in a standard, just like foundation type house, you can live in an RV. A lot of people are living out of vans now. There's a lot of different modalities. So with all these different modalities of living and existing, you have to understand exactly, where am I gonna put this? It might sway you in a different direction, and specifically a tiny house on wheels might not be the best modality for you. So the three main places that I wrote down that you can live in a tiny house legally or a little bit illegally, you're going into a bit of the gray area. First one would be in a friend's backyard or on someone's land. So for example, say someone has a big acreage like 10 acres, 20 acres, 40 acres or something like that, and they already have like a main house on it, is that you could ask that person and be like, hey, can I park my tiny house in this area on your property? I'll pay you a little bit of rent. That seems to be one of the most common areas where people park their tiny homes. And another main area where people park their tiny homes are in RV parks. So even in one of the RV parks in Benson, Arizona here, is that even though it's mainly focused just on like regular RVs, there are people who have had like a tiny house on wheels just like this built, and that's what they consider their RV, and that's what they live in. Now, a lot of people might not want to go that route specifically, but there is another option as well within the RV park realm, and that is that there's a lot of tiny house specific RV parks where people are coming together and creating a community like an RV park, but they're all parking their tiny house on wheels. So that's another place where you can put it. Now the last one that I'm gonna talk about is putting your tiny house on wheels on your own property, kind of like what we're doing right here. Now this is where you enter into a realm where I can't talk in generalities, because if I talk in generalities, like just being very broad, it's kind of hard to explain, because it's not hard to explain, it's easy to explain. See, the thing is, all the rules revolving around whether you can live in an RV on your property legally depends on county by county. And so what we live in here in Cochise County is what Michael Reynolds of Earthships, what he would call is a pocket of freedom. So there's going to be certain counties around the United States and other countries and stuff where you could park a tiny house on wheels and have it be considered a legal structure. But for the vast majority of the counties, it's not something that you could just call your permanent residence. But there are pockets of freedom, specifically I know around the United States, where you could just take your tiny house on wheels, park it on your property, and basically the county doesn't really give a crap. So the first question that you want to ask yourself, where am I gonna put it? And so you can do just like Google searches and just figure out where people are putting their tiny homes, because there are a number of different options. So definitely explore all those different options. Now the next question that you want to ask yourself is, what do you see in your future? Are you wanting to live in an off-grid structure like we're going to be living in the future, or do you plan on having children? What do you see going into your future? Because that's also going to make a difference, whether or not a tiny house on wheels is going to be right for you. Because one thing that I've noticed in the tiny house community is that there have been a lot of people who have built and lived in their tiny homes for a few years, but they end up either selling it or they just kind of outgrow the house. So I know specifically Melissa and Chris Tack of their little tiny house is called the Tiny Tack House, and they were definitely one of the original people in the tiny house movement when it really started to garner a lot of attention. I follow them both on Instagram, and recently they just had a baby. And now they're not actually living in their tiny home. They're living in a main home, and I believe what they're doing is they are Airbnb-ing, is that actually a phrase? They're Airbnb-ing their tiny house. So they used their tiny house, the two of them, lived in their tiny house for a number of years, they had a baby, and then they had to move out of it, and now they're using their tiny house as an extra stream of revenue, I guess you could say. The tiny house that we looked at in San Diego, it was a young single mother that built the house herself with help of some friends, and her daughter was going to live in the tiny house and then also live with her father as well. But for some reason, the daughter got it in her mind that she didn't want to live in a tiny house. So the lady who built it was trying to sell it, and then she wanted to go she had to go rent an apartment so that basically her daughter would live with her. There's many other stories that you kind of see floating around the internet about people who have moved into a tiny home, it's not really for them, and then they move out. So if you're kind of not really sure if a tiny house is right for you, what I would certainly recommend is that there's many tiny homes around the United States where you can actually just go stay in them for a night like a hotel. And that's a really good idea just so that you can get an idea of the space. And it was really good for Hannah and I to go stay in that tiny house in San Diego, because just staying in it one night, we just totally felt like, yeah, this is totally enough space. Like we could really see ourselves living in it. So I think that's really important for people, is actually just go stay in one just for a night or two, just so that you can kind of get an idea of if it's gonna be the right fit for you. So I think it's really important to just start off by thinking, where am I going in life, and what is gonna be the best housing modality for that life that I want to create? Now I do wanna just touch upon a question that a lot of people have asked is, a lot of people are like, why would you build or spend all the money and the time to build a tiny house on wheels, and you're moving it on a piece of property, and you have to build another house anyways? Why would you do that when you could have just bought like an RV? So that's a very good question, and I'm gonna give you a very good answer. I would say that our living situation is very much tied into our career as well. So specifically, Hannah's YouTube is focused around creating epic plant-based recipes, and creating videos in our old kitchen in Tucson. It absolutely sucked for her because the lighting was shitty, it wasn't even a really nice kitchen. So when your entire career is focused around creating awesome food, it really makes sense to have a nice kitchen area where you can record yourselves making those epic recipes. So if we had like a standard RV, the kitchen layout would probably not be very good, and it would not be the same in the way that we designed this tiny house on wheels. Keep in mind that when we first started building the tiny house, we didn't know exactly where we're gonna put it. We originally thought that we were going to be moving to San Diego. Then we also had the idea maybe it'd be nice to go live in Portland for 3 to 6 months, or go live in Colorado, Boulder specifically, for 3 to 6 months. So we weren't exactly sure what we were going to be doing, but it was after we started building the tiny house, that's when we kind of decided, all right, let's set up shop somewhere. We really enjoyed the Tucson area and we really enjoyed the climate, so that's why we started looking for land, specifically in Cochise County, because it's still in southwestern Arizona. It's still very close to Tucson, and we weren't sure exactly what we're gonna do with the tiny house when we started building it. But it's turned out really good for us, and that's because we're able to park this on our land while we're gonna be building our main house. And all the while, Hannah has the opportunity to make really epic videos on our YouTube channel. And I think that's definitely one of the main focuses that we had when we were building and designing this, is that we wanted to make the kitchen area basically as video friendly as possible so that she can make really nice videos. And if you've noticed and you follow Hannah on her YouTube channel, she's been putting out videos like no other. She just keeps pumping them out. That's because she has the proper workspace in order to make those videos. So she just feels much more inspired. It's much easier for her to make the videos, and the video quality is much better than anything that she's been able to put out before. That's just because she just didn't have the area in order to record those videos. So specifically, if you're gonna do what we're gonna do, which is we have this small house, we're gonna be building a garage and then a main house. Typically what you would do in this circumstance is that you just buy like maybe a 25 to 30 foot long RV and just live in that and get it hooked up to water and electricity and all that kind of stuff while you build the other house. So that's exactly what Bob and Karen, they just lived in a travel trailer while they built their 600 square foot cob house. And what's great about specifically this area here, this county, is that you can just leave your tiny house or you can leave your RV where it is, and then it can also be used for guests, for friends, family, etc. So hopefully you can make a more educated choice about whether or not a tiny house on wheels is going to be right for you, because it might be the best living modality for you, and it also might not be. So I don't want anyone to feel crappy or regretful because they invested in a tiny house and then they realize afterwards it's like, that was actually a really bad choice. Even though these things tend to be a lot cheaper than a regular home, they still cost a lot of cash. So I just want to help any of you that are just, maybe you're just not exactly sure, or maybe you're very excited to do it, but maybe it's just not going to be the right modality for you. So the number one pro of tiny houses, and this is why most people get into the movement, is the cost. So tiny homes can range vastly in prices, but they've been built for as cheap as like $10,000. Average price is probably somewhere between $20,000 to $30,000. So that's one of the main pros of a tiny home. Another main pro of a tiny home is that they can fit into areas where housing is limited and expensive. So for example, if you were to live in Seattle or Portland, where homes are very expensive, especially to buy, rent prices are very high. So a lot of people in those areas where that is the case, they're much more like, maybe a tiny home would be a better solution for me. And then they just park it typically in someone's backyard. Another pro of tiny homes is that it's mobile. It is on wheels. Now, I wouldn't say that you want to be traveling around with your tiny house on wheels like consistently, but if you're only moving it maybe once or twice a year, then I think that's totally fine. Another pro for tiny homes is lower utility costs. So your electricity is most likely going to be cheaper just because you're going to be using less of it because it's a much smaller space. Chances are you're going to be using less water as well. And other utilities like natural gas or propane, you're probably going to be using a lot less than a regular size home. Another nice pro of tiny homes is that since it is so small, you can use much more expensive materials on the inside and it won't like just break the bank. For example, flooring is very expensive. We put, I think how much the flooring costs in here is like $5 a square foot or something like that. But since it's so small, it doesn't seem Like it was only about $1,000 for all the flooring. So it didn't seem like it was that expensive, because say you're gonna put that same flooring in a much larger home, it might be costing you $5,000 to $10,000 to $20,000. Another pro of a tiny home is that it can be used, you can put it on Airbnb, you can use it to host family and friends. So maybe it's almost it would be good for people who want maybe another living quarters on their property somewhere that isn't gonna be like within their main house. So they can have family over, they can have friends over, kind of like what we're gonna be doing with this eventually. Now let's go over some of the cons for tiny houses on wheels. One of the main things is it can be difficult to find a place to put it. For a lot of people in the living situations that they put their tiny houses in, is that they're kind of getting into a gray area in the law. So it can be difficult to exactly find a place to put it, but the good thing is that you can move it. So another con would be that this would be classified as a recreational vehicle or just purely as a trailer. And just with that type of designation, it does make it more difficult to call this your permanent residence, kind of like what I talked about in the last point. One of the most obvious cons would be that it is a small space, and specifically with tiny homes like this, it would be very difficult to expand it. Like, I would not be adding on any structures within the living space of the tiny house. Like, it is as it is, whereas like with a regular foundation home, it can be much easier to expand that home. I wrote this point in the cons section, but it's just more of an observation, I would say, is that a tiny house on wheels would be ideal specifically only for couples and for single people. For families, growing families, I just don't see this as a really good housing option. I know that there are families who do live in tiny homes, but I can't specifically comment on how healthy of a living situation that would be. But somebody else with that specific living instance would be able to comment on that. I guess in a way, we have 2 dogs, but it's not the same as having a child, let's say that. Another thing with tiny homes is that you have to figure out the Greywater and Blackwater disposal. So most people in tiny homes just go with a composting toilet, so that's kind of taken care of. But even with that, people, specifically where you're gonna be putting it, you have to bring that up as well, because you could be like, yeah, I'm gonna be using a composting toilet, so I'm gonna be disposing of my waste either in a compost bin, or I'm gonna be disposing of it just directly into the trash. So your host for where your tiny house is gonna be, you're gonna wanna obviously talk about that and whether or not they're gonna be comfortable with that living circumstance. Greywater is pretty easy to dispose of. You can just pipe the drains to basically an infiltration basin. You could plant like a fruit tree there, and then you never have to water it because it's always watered just with the Greywater. But in certain counties that would be considered illegal, even though it's very environmentally safe for the most part. So that's kind of a bit of a con, but yeah, it's just kind of a weird situation. So is a tiny house on wheels right for you? Just don't go into this completely blinded and just be like, I need to do this. This is gonna be the best thing for me, without looking at different modalities, because you might regret the choice. Do we regret this? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. 100%. Really actually enjoy the space. Personally, we don't even feel like we need a bigger home to live in. It's just that the minimum home requirement, specifically in this county, is 400 square feet. So actually I think you can go down to 270, but if there's gonna be 2 people living in it, then it needs to be 400. But it's like, how do they figure that stuff out? Anyways, different counties are gonna have different rules. But we've been living in this for just over 3 months now, and we really enjoy the space. Like, it's very comfortable for us. It's really nice having the 2 lofts that we can both sit in, so that we both kind of have our own little space, and especially having the outdoor space is just tremendous. So putting your tiny house on wheels in a place where you can be outdoors a lot, specifically like maybe Arizona, California, like that is really a big benefit of this area, because we don't feel so claustrophobic in the house because we're stuck inside of it all day long, every single day, especially maybe during the winter time. We can go outside and we can really enjoy our outdoor space, which is why this patio is so nice. So don't take the decision lightly. Definitely think about all your different options. Think about where you're going to be going in life. What does your future hold for you? And don't think that if you do live in a tiny house that you have to live in it for the rest of your life. If it's something that is only going to work for you for the next 5 years or maybe 10 years, then do it for 5 or 10 years. A tiny home like this is still going to hold some type of value. So if you ever want to sell it down the road, you're still going to probably recuperate a lot of the costs. But you can also think of this as an investment as well. Rather than always just renting places, renting, you can invest your money into something like this, and you could probably just drastically reduce your rent. Because if you're still going to be putting this on someone's property, you're going to be paying something monthly in order for them to host you. Awesome. I hope that helps. If you have any more questions or comments about tiny houses on wheels, leave them in the comment box below, and I'll catch you guys on the next video. Talk to you soon.